The dust kicked up behind Sarah Mitchell's truck as she drove down the long gravel road leading to the Double R Ranch. It was early September, and the Montana sky stretched endlessly above her, so blue it almost hurt to look at. She'd made this drive hundreds of times over the past 2 years, but today felt different. Today, her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, and her jaw was set in a way that would have told anyone who knew her that a storm was brewing. She parked near the main house, a sprawling structure that had seen better days but still stood proud against the backdrop of rolling hills and distant mountains. The paint was peeling in places, and the porch sagged slightly on one side, but it was home. Or at least it had started to feel that way, which was precisely the problem. Jake Richardson was exactly where she expected him to be at 7 in the morning. Out by the horse corral, checking on the mare that was due to foal any day now, he stood with one boot propped on the lower fence rail, his weathered cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes, completely absorbed in watching the pregnant horse move slowly around the enclosure. Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward him, her boots crunching on the dry ground. He didn't turn around, but she knew he'd heard her. Jake always knew when someone was nearby. It was like he had some sixth sense developed from years of working alone on this massive property. "Morning," he said without looking at her. His voice was low and rough, like gravel tumbling in a stream. "We need to talk," Sarah said, stopping a few feet behind him. Now he turned, slowly, and she saw the brief flash of something in his eyes before his expression settled into that neutral mask he wore so well. "About what?" "About us. About this." She gestured between them, then around at the ranch. "About whatever this is we've been doing for the past 2 years. Jake pushed his hat back slightly and studied her face. At 42, he was 15 years older than Sarah, and every one of those years showed in the lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair. But there was something ageless about him too, something solid and unchanging that had drawn her in from the very beginning. "I thought things were fine," he said carefully. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fine. That's exactly the word I'd use. Everything with you is fine, Jake. The weather's fine. The cattle are fine.
The work is fine."
But what about us? Are we fine?" He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Sarah, I don't know what you want me to say. That's the whole problem, isn't it? You never know what to say. Or maybe you do know, but you won't say it." The mare whinnied softly in the corral, and Jake glanced back at her before returning his attention to Sarah. The morning sun was climbing higher now, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. In the distance, Sarah could hear the low of cattle and the creak of the windmill by the old barn. She'd come to the Double R Ranch 2 years ago, answering an ad Jake had placed for a ranch hand. She'd grown up on a farm in eastern Montana, knew her way around horses and cattle, and desperately needed a fresh start after her divorce. The job came with room and board in the small cottage behind the main house, decent pay, and more importantly, distance from everything she was trying to escape. Jake had hired her on the spot, much to the surprise of several local men who'd also applied. But Sarah had proven herself worth it within the first week. She could ride as well as anyone, wasn't afraid of hard work, and had a natural way with animals that Jake appreciated. She was also quiet, didn't pry into his business, and seemed content with the solitary nature of ranch life. For the first 6 months, their relationship was purely professional. Jake was her boss, she was his employee, and that was that. They'd work side by side during the day, sometimes for hours without speaking, and then go their separate ways in the evening. Sarah would retreat to her cottage, and Jake would disappear into the main house, both of them wrapped in their own private worlds. But slowly, things had shifted. It started small. Jake began inviting her up to the main house for dinner once or twice a week. Then they started having coffee together on the porch in the mornings before work. They'd talk about the ranch, about the weather, about nothing and everything. Sarah learned that Jake's wife had died 5 years earlier from cancer, leaving him alone on this massive ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations. She learned that he had a daughter in Seattle who rarely visited, that he'd been a Marine before taking over the ranch, that he liked his coffee black and his steak rare. Jake learned that Sarah had married young to a man who turned out to be very different from what she'd thought, that she'd spent years trying to make something work that was fundamentally broken, that she'd finally found the courage to leave with nothing but her truck and her sadness. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, that she had a sharp sense of humor hidden beneath her quiet exterior, that she sang to the horses when she thought no one could hear. The shift from friendship to something more had been gradual and unspoken, a hand lingering a moment too long when passing tools. Eyes meeting across the barn and holding just a beat longer than necessary. The awareness of the other person that crept into every moment, even when they were apart. The first time Jake kissed her, it was late on a summer evening. They'd been fixing fence line all day, and Sarah had gotten tangled in barbed wire trying to stretch it tight. Jake had carefully extracted her, his calloused hands gentle as he checked her arm for cuts. When he looked up and saw her watching him, something in his expression cracked open, and before either of them could think better of it, his mouth was on hers. That had been over a year ago, and since then, they'd fallen into a pattern that was comfortable but undefined. Sarah still slept in her cottage most nights, but sometimes she stayed in the main house. They worked together during the day, ate meals together, spent their evenings side by side on the porch or in front of the fireplace. To anyone looking from the outside, they were a couple. But Jake had never called her his girlfriend, never talked about the future, never put a name to what they were doing, and Sarah had let it slide, telling herself she was fine with the ambiguity. She'd been so burned by her marriage that part of her appreciated Jake's reticence to label things. But lately, it had started to feel less like caution and more like avoidance, like Jake was deliberately keeping her at arm's length even while pulling her close. "I want to know what we're doing," Sarah said now, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I want to know if this is going somewhere, or if I'm just convenient. If I'm just someone to warm your bed and help with the ranch work." Jake flinched as if she'd slapped him. "That's not fair, isn't it?" "Jake, we've been together for over a year, and you've never once talked about the future. You've never asked me to stay permanently. You've never even told me how you feel about me. You know how I feel." "Do I? Because from where I'm standing, I have no idea." "You're kind to me. You're affectionate sometimes, Evidence. But kind and affectionate aren't the same as love, Jake." "And I need to know if you love me, or if I'm just filling a space in your life that would otherwise be empty." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and inescapable. Jake looked away, his jaw working as if he was chewing on something bitter. The mare in the corral came over to the fence where they stood, probably hoping for a treat, but neither of them acknowledged her. "I'm not good at this," Jake finally said. "I'm not good at talking about feelings. I'm not asking you to write poetry. I'm asking you to be honest with me. About what you want, about where you see this going, about whether I'm wasting my time hoping for something you're never going to give me." "You're not wasting your time," he said quickly, looking back at her with something almost like desperation in his eyes. "Sarah, you're not wasting your time." "What are we doing?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. She could see him struggling, could see the words fighting to get out, and him fighting to keep them in. It was like watching someone try to swim against a rip current, exhausting and futile. "I care about you," he finally managed. "You know I do." "That's not enough anymore," Sarah said softly. "God knows I care about you more than I should, but I can't keep living in this limbo. I can't keep wondering if you're going to wake up one day and decide this was all a mistake, if you're going to realize you don't actually want me here permanently." "I want you here," he said, and there was more emotion in those 4 words than she'd heard from him in months. "As what? Your employee? Your friend? Your lover? What am I to you, Jake?" He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of deep frustration. "Why do we have to put a label on it? Why can't things just be the way they are? 'Cause I'm 27 years old, and I want a life, Jake, a real life. Not this half-life where I'm afraid to leave my shampoo in your shower or hang my coat in your closet because I don't know if I'm actually supposed to be there. I want to know if you see a future with me or if you're just passing time until something better comes along." "Something better?" Jake's voice rose for the first time, anger flashing across his face. "You think I'm waiting for something better? Sarah, there is nothing better. You're the best thing that's happened to me in 5 years. Then why won't you say it? Why won't you commit to this, to us?" And there it was, the question that had been building for months, finally out in the open. Sarah felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. She'd crossed a line, pushed him to a place she wasn't sure he could follow her to. Jake stared at her, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes. Whatever he said next would change everything, and they both knew it. The morning breeze picked up, carrying the scent of hay and horses and the wild grass that covered the hills. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, harsh and insistent. "I need time to think," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah felt something inside her chest crack, like ice on a pond in early spring. "You need time to think." "Jake, we've been together for a year. How much more time do you need?" I need to figure some things out. Either you want me or you don't. Either you love me or you don't. It's not that complicated." "Yes, it is," he said, and now his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "For me, it is." They stood there, facing each other across a divide that felt wider than the ranch itself. Sarah could feel tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough over men who couldn't or wouldn't love her properly. She wasn't going to do it again. "Okay," she said quietly, "you think. But while you're thinking, I'm going to make some decisions of my own." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not going to sit around waiting for you to decide if I'm worth committing to. I got a call last week from my cousin in Wyoming. She needs help on her ranch. Offered me a job. I turned it down because I was here, because I thought this meant something. But maybe I should reconsider." Jake's face went pale. "You're leaving?" "But I need you to understand something, Jake Richardson. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life in limbo. I'm not going to be the woman you keep at arm's length because you're too scared or too damaged or too whatever to let me in completely. I deserve more than that. I deserve someone who knows they want me and isn't afraid to say it." She turned to walk away, but his hand shot out and caught her wrist, not hard, but firm enough to stop her. When she looked back at him, she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression that she'd never seen before. "Please don't leave," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "Please, Sarah, just give me a little more time." She gently pulled her wrist free. "I've given you a year, Jake. How much more time do you need?" He didn't answer, just stood there looking lost and desperate and utterly unable to say what she needed to hear. Sarah felt her heart breaking, but she also felt something else. A clarity. Maybe a recognition that sometimes love isn't enough if the other person can't meet you where you are. "I'm going to go fix the north gate," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "The hinge was loose yesterday. When I get back, maybe you'll have figured out what you want to say to me." She walked away, leaving him standing by the corral with the pregnant mare and the weight of her question hanging in the air. As she climbed into the ranch truck and headed toward the north pasture, Sarah let herself glance in the rearview mirror. Jake was still standing there, watching her go, his hat in his hands and his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look older than his 42 years. She gripped the steering wheel and forced herself to look forward, at the road ahead, at the work that needed doing. The north gate was 3 miles away, which meant she had about 15 minutes to collect herself before she had to focus on the task at hand. 15 minutes to wonder if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life or finally stood up for what she deserved. The prairie stretched out around her, endless and beautiful and lonely. So incredibly lonely. And for the first time since she'd arrived at the Double R Ranch, Sarah wondered if maybe that loneliness was trying to tell her something she'd been too afraid to hear. The north gate hung crooked on its hinges, just as Sarah remembered. She pulled the truck to a stop and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, staring at the broken gate without really seeing it. Her conversation with Jake played on a loop in her mind, his silence louder than any words could have been. She climbed out of the truck and grabbed her toolbox from the bed. The work would be good, she told herself. Physical labor always helped clear her head. She'd learned that during the worst days of her marriage, when working herself to exhaustion was the only thing that let her sleep at night. The gate had been damaged during last week's storm, when a branch from the old cottonwood tree crashed down on it. Sarah examined the twisted metal, the splintered wood, and made a mental inventory of what needed fixing. The hinge pins were bent, the crossbar had cracked, and the whole structure needed reinforcing. It would take most of the morning, maybe longer. She set to work, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of repair. Remove the damaged parts. Assess what could be salvaged. Replace what couldn't. It was straightforward, logical, unlike the mess of emotions churning in her gut. As she worked, her mind drifted back to how it all started. She'd been so broken when she first arrived at the Double R Ranch. Her divorce had been finalized only 3 months earlier, and she'd felt like a complete failure. 25 years old and already washed up at life, or at least that's how it felt. Her ex-husband had spent their entire marriage making her feel small, incompetent, worthless. By the time she left, she'd almost believed him. Jake had been different from the start. He didn't hover or micromanage. He'd show her something once, trust her to do it right, and move on. When she made mistakes, he'd simply show her how to fix them without judgment or criticism. Slowly, over those first few months, she'd started to remember who she was before her marriage had ground her down to nothing. She'd fallen for him somewhere along the way, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly when. Maybe it was the day she found him in the barn at midnight, sitting with a sick calf, his big weathered hands gentle as he bottle-fed the struggling animal. Maybe it was the afternoon he taught her to rope, standing behind her to guide her movements, his breath warm against her ear. Or maybe it was the hundreds of small moments in between, the quiet companionship that had felt like coming home. But now she wondered if she'd mistaken gratitude for love, if she'd been so starved for kindness that she'd built up their relationship into something more than it actually was. Maybe Jake saw her as exactly what she'd accused him of seeing her as: convenient. Someone to share the burden of the ranch, warm his bed on cold nights, and ask nothing more of him than he was willing to give. The thought made her throat tight. She'd sworn after her divorce that she'd never again settle for less than she deserved. Yet here she was, 2 years later, in almost the same position. Different man, different circumstances, but the same core problem. She was giving more than she was getting, loving someone who couldn't or wouldn't love her back the way she needed. Sarah wrenched a bolt free with more force than necessary, skinning her knuckles in the process. She cursed and stuck her hand in her mouth, tasting blood and rust. The physical pain was almost welcome, something concrete and real to focus on instead of the ache in her chest. The sun climbed higher as she worked, and the morning grew hot. She stripped off her jacket and worked in her tank top, sweat dampening her back and temples. By noon, she'd replaced the damaged hinge and was working on reinforcing the crossbar when she heard the sound of another truck approaching. Her heart jumped, thinking it might be Jake. But when she looked up, she saw Tom Bradley's dusty red pickup pulling to a stop behind her own truck. Tom was Jake's nearest neighbor, his ranch bordering the Double R on the eastern side. He was a widower in his early 50s, a good man who'd been nothing but friendly to Sarah since she arrived. "Heard you might need some help with this gate," Tom called out as he climbed from his truck. He was carrying what looked like a new crossbar. "Jake called," said the wood was more damaged than you thought. Sarah straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm. Jake had called Tom. "That was unexpected. That's kind of you, but I've got it handled." Tom walked over anyway, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. He was a tall man with a weathered face and kind eyes, the sort of person who'd drop everything to help a neighbor in need. "No doubt you do, but 2 pairs of hands make light work. Besides, Jake sounded worried about you being out here alone with that storm rolling in." Sure enough, dark clouds were building in the west, their bellies heavy with rain. She'd been so absorbed in her work and her thoughts that she hadn't noticed. "I've worked in rain before," she said, but there was no heat in her words. Tom set the crossbar down and leaned against the fence, studying her with the same careful attention he probably gave sick cattle. "You want to talk about it? Talk about what? Whatever's got you attacking that gate like it personally offended you." Despite everything, Sarah felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been where you are." Tom pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his grey-streaked hair. "I know that look. Had it myself after Margaret died. That look that says you're trying to work your way through something that can't be fixed with tools and elbow grease." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then surprised herself by saying, "How did you know Margaret was the one? Before you married her, I mean." Tom's expression softened. "Well, that's a question. I suppose I knew, because when I imagined my future, I couldn't picture it without her in it. Tried to, a few times, just to see if I could. But every vision I had of tomorrow, next week, next year, she was always there. Made me realize that wasn't imagination, that was just seeing things clear. And if someone can't picture that, their future with you in it, then I'd say they're either lying to themselves or to you, and neither one's worth building a life on." He paused, then added gently, "Jake's a good man, Sarah. One of the best I know. But he's been alone a long time, And being alone that long can make a man forget how to be any other way. How long is too long to wait for someone to remember? That's a question only you can answer, but I'll tell you what my Margaret told me once when I was being stubborn about something. She said, "Tom, love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every day. And if someone won't choose you back, then they're choosing something else instead. Maybe fear, maybe comfort, maybe the past. But they're choosing not you, and you deserve better than being someone's second choice." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She sounds like she was a wise woman. Smarter than me by a mile, that's for certain. Tom put his hat back on. "Now, how about we get this gate fixed before that storm hits? Then we can both head home and get out of the weather." They worked together for the next hour, and Sarah was grateful for Tom's steady presence and the distraction of shared labor. He didn't pry further, didn't offer more unwanted advice, just helped her finish the job while making easy conversation about ranching, the weather, and the upcoming county fair. By the time they were done, the storm clouds had rolled much closer, and the wind had picked up, carrying the electric smell of approaching rain. They stood back and admired their work, the gate now straight and sturdy on its new hinges. "That'll hold," Tom said with satisfaction. "You did good work here, Sarah." "We did good work," she corrected. He smiled. "That too. You heading back to the main house?" "Might drive around and check the fence line first." Tom gave her a knowing look but didn't argue. "You be careful out there. Storm looks like it could get nasty." He climbed into his truck, then leaned out the window. "Sarah, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Asking for what you need. Some people need to be pushed to the edge before they realize what they're about to lose. And some people need to walk away to realize they deserve to be chased." He drove off before she could respond, leaving her standing by the newly repaired gate with his words echoing in her ears. She looked at the approaching storm, then at her own truck, then made a decision. She wasn't ready to go back yet. Wasn't ready to face Jake and whatever half answers he might have prepared. Instead, she drove slowly along the northern fence line, checking posts and wire, taking her time. The storm was moving faster than she'd expected, though. By the time she reached the northeast corner of the property, the first fat raindrops were splattering against her windshield. She should turn back, should head to the house before the storm really hit, but something stubborn in her kept driving, kept pushing further out. Maybe it was childish, making Jake worry. Or maybe it was necessary, showing him what it felt like when someone you cared about wasn't where you expected them to be. The rain came harder, turning the dirt road into slick mud. Sarah's windshield wipers worked furiously, but visibility was dropping fast. She was just starting to think she'd been foolish when she saw it, a dark shape in the distance, near the old line shack at the furthest corner of the Double R. She squinted through the rain-streaked windshield. Was that a horse? Her heart sank as she got closer and realized it was. One of Jake's mares standing in the driving rain, clearly agitated. And if Sarah wasn't mistaken, it was Belle, the pregnant mare from this morning. "No, no, no," Sarah muttered, pulling the truck as close as she could and jumping out into the rain. She was soaked instantly, her clothes plastered to her skin, hair whipping in the wind. But her focus was entirely on Belle, who was pacing in tight circles, her sides heaving. The mare was in labor. Had to be. But what was she doing all the way out here? The corrals near the main house had been checked and secured. Belle must have gotten out somehow, wandered off following some instinct to find a private place to foal. Sarah approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy, girl. Easy now." "I've got you." Belle's eyes were rolling white with fear and pain, but she recognized Sarah and stood still long enough for Sarah to get a hand on her halter. There was no way Sarah could get Belle into the truck, and even if she could, the drive back in these conditions with a horse in active labor would be dangerous. The line shack would have to do. It was old and probably leaking, but it would provide some shelter from the worst of the storm. She led Belle to the shack, grateful to find the door unlocked. Inside was dim and musty, but mostly dry. There were old blankets in a trunk, left over from when ranch hands used to stay out here during cattle drives. Sarah spread them on the floor and managed to get Belle settled. Then she grabbed her phone to call Jake, only to find she had no signal. Dusk, of course. They were in a dead zone, too far from the house and too low in the valley for her phone to catch anything. She was on her own. Her and Belle and a foal that was trying very hard to be born in the middle of a storm. Miles from help. Sarah took a deep breath and rolled up her sleeves. She'd helped with dozens of births, both at her family's farm and here at the Double R. She knew what to do. But knowing and doing when you're alone in a storm with no backup are two different things. "All right, Belle," she said, kneeling beside the laboring mare. "You and me, we've got this. We don't need anyone else." Even as she said it, though, she wished Jake was there. Not because she couldn't handle it alone, but because she wanted to share it with him. Wanted to look up and see him standing in the doorway. Wanted to work side by side with him bringing this new life into the world. Wanted to be a team, the way she'd thought they were. But Jake wasn't there. She was alone, like she'd been alone for most of the important moments in her life. Like she might always be alone if she kept waiting for someone who couldn't commit to being by her side. The storm raged outside, and Belle's laboring intensified, and Sarah pushed everything else from her mind. There would be time later to think about Jake, about her future, about what she was going to do. Right now, all that mattered was this mare and her foal, and making sure they'd both made it through the night. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the walls, and thunder rolled across the prairie like the voice of something ancient and unstoppable. Sarah worked by the light of her phone's flashlight, her hands steady and sure despite the fear fluttering in her chest. She might be alone, but she wasn't helpless. She'd survived a broken marriage, rebuilt herself from nothing, and carved out a life on this ranch through sheer determination and hard work. She could survive this too. Whatever happened next, with Jake or without him, she would survive. Jake stood on his porch, staring out at the storm, and felt fear clawing at his chest in a way he hadn't experienced since his Marine days. Sarah had been gone for 7 hours. 7 hours in weather that had turned from bad to dangerous in the space of an afternoon. He'd tried calling her phone a dozen times. No answer. He'd driven out to the north gate around noon and found it repaired, Tom's truck just pulling away. Tom had assured him Sarah was fine, just needed some space to think. So Jake had driven back home, telling himself to give her that space, to use the time to figure out what he was going to say to her. But thinking time had turned into worry time, and worry had turned into full-blown panic as the storm rolled in and Sarah still hadn't come back. He'd called her phone again and again, each unanswered ring making his chest tighter. Finally, he'd saddled his horse and started riding the fence line, looking for any sign of her truck. His daughter had called earlier, one of her rare check-ins. He'd barely been able to focus on the conversation, his mind on Sarah somewhere out in the storm. Katie had picked up on his distraction immediately. "Dad, what's wrong?" she'd asked. And Jake, who never talked about his personal life with anyone, found himself telling his daughter everything. About Sarah, about their relationship, about that morning's confrontation, about how Sarah had driven off and hadn't come back. "So let me get this straight," Katie had said, her voice sharp with the particular brand of irritation only a daughter can muster for her father. "You have a smart, capable, beautiful woman who loves you, who's been by your side for 2 years, who makes you happy, and when she asks if you love her back, you say you need time to think." "It's complicated," Jake had protested weakly. "No, Dad, it's not. You're just scared. And I get it. I really do. Losing Mum was terrible. But you can't let fear of losing someone keep you from loving them. That's not honoring Mum's memory. That's just being afraid to live." Her words had hit him like a physical blow, knocking loose something he'd been trying to keep locked down tight. "I don't know how to do this, Katie. After your mum, I thought I was done. I thought that was it for me. One great love in a lifetime." "Maybe it was," Katie had said softly. "But maybe you get more than one if you're lucky. And maybe pushing away your second chance because you're afraid of getting hurt again is the worst way to honor the first one." Now, standing on the porch with rain lashing down and no sign of Sarah, Jake realized his daughter was right. He'd been so focused on protecting himself from potential pain that he'd inflicted it anyway, on both himself and on the woman he loved, because he did love Sarah. He'd known it for months, maybe longer. He just hadn't let himself admit it, much less say it out loud. He'd lost Emma to cancer, watched her fade away despite everything the doctors tried, despite his prayers, despite how desperately he'd wanted her to stay. It had broken something in him. That loss made him believe that loving someone was just setting yourself up for inevitable heartbreak. So when Sarah had come into his life, bright and damaged and determined to heal herself, he'd kept his distance emotionally even as he let her get closer physically. He'd told himself it was kindness, giving her space to recover from her divorce. But really, it was cowardice. He'd been too afraid to risk his heart again, too afraid of the pain that might come if he admitted how much he needed her. And now she was out there somewhere in a dangerous storm, and he might never get the chance to tell her any of it. Jake was just about to saddle a fresh horse and continue searching when he saw headlights cutting through the rain. For a moment, his heart leaped, thinking it was Sarah. But it was Tom's truck that pulled up, and Tom's worried face that appeared as he ran through the rain to the porch. "Her truck's at the Northeast Line Shack," Tom said without preamble. "I was checking my fence line near your property and saw it. Couldn't get close enough in my truck to check on her. The road's washed out. But the truck's there, and there was a light inside the shack." Relief and fresh worry washed over Jake in equal measure. She was alive. She had shelter. But the Northeast Line Shack was 4 miles from the main house, and if the road was washed out, she was trapped there until the storm passed and the ground dried out. "I'm going after her," Jake said, already moving toward the barn. "On horseback? In this weather?" "Jake, that's crazy. She's alone out there. What if she's hurt? What if something's wrong?" "Then we go together. You're not riding into this storm alone. Give me 5 minutes to get my horse." But Jake was already pulling on his rain gear, his mind made up. "I appreciate it, Tom, but I need to do this. I need to be the one who goes to her." Tom studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you take my radio. And if you're not back or haven't called by dawn, I'm coming after both of you." The ride to the Northeast Line Shack was one of the hardest things Jake had ever done. The wind tried to push him off his horse, the rain blinded him, and the lightning made his mount skittish and nervous. But he kept going, driven by the need to get to Sarah, to make sure she was okay, to finally tell her all the things he should have said months ago. It took him nearly an hour to cover the 4 miles, but finally he saw the dark shape of the Line Shack emerging from the storm. There was indeed a light inside, flickering and dim. Sarah's truck was parked nearby, and Jake's heart nearly stopped when he saw Belle standing under the lean-to attached to the shack. He tied his horse next to Belle and pushed open the door to the shack. The scene that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Sarah was kneeling on the floor, covered in blood and amniotic fluid, her hair plastered to her face with sweat and rain, and nestled beside Belle, still wet and wobbly, was a tiny foal. Sarah's head snapped up at his entrance, and Jake saw exhaustion and relief and something fierce and proud in her eyes. "I got her out here," she said, her voice hoarse. "Belle wandered off and went into labor. I couldn't leave her." Jake stood there, speechless, looking at this woman who delivered a foal alone in a storm, rather than abandon an animal in need. This woman who was so much stronger than he'd ever given her credit for. This woman he'd been too afraid to love properly. "Are you okay?" he finally managed to ask. "I'm fine. We're all fine. It was a difficult birth, but we made it through." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing more blood across her cheek. "What are you doing here?" "Coming to find you. I was worried." "I can take care of myself, Jake. I've proven that tonight. I know you can." He took a step closer, then another, until he was kneeling beside her on the floor. Up close, he could see how exhausted she was, how hard she'd worked, how scared she must have been. "I've always known you could. That was never the question." "Then what was the question?" "Because I meant what I said this morning. I need to know what this is, what we are. I can't keep living in uncertainty." Jake looked at the foal, then at Belle, then back at Sarah. And suddenly, all the fear that had been holding him back seemed ridiculous compared to the fear of losing her. "Can I tell you something?" he asked quietly. "I think you better. When Emma died, I thought my life was over." "Not in a dramatic way, just in a practical sense. I thought I'd had my time, my love, my chance at happiness, and it was done. The ranch would keep me busy, and that would be enough. It had to be enough because I couldn't imagine surviving the pain of losing someone again." Sarah was quiet, watching him with those sharp eyes that always seemed to see more than he wanted to show. "Then you showed up," Jake continued, "and you were so broken and so determined to put yourself back together. I told myself I was just helping you out, giving you a job, a place to heal. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being my employee and started being my friend. And then you became more than that. And I was too much of a coward to admit it." "Why?" The single word was soft but firm. "Because loving you meant risking my heart again. meant opening myself up to the possibility of loss and pain. And I didn't think I could survive going through that a second time. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. But you know what scared me even more? The thought of you leaving. The thought of waking up one day and you not being here. The thought of going back to the way things were before you arrived. Sarah's eyes were shining now. Though whether with tears or just the reflection of the flashlight, Jake couldn't tell. You're saying this because you're relieved I'm okay. Tomorrow when the storm passes and everything is back to normal, you'll go back to keeping me at arm's length. No. The word came out harder than he intended. No, I won't. 'Cause tonight, riding through that storm to find you, I realized something. Being afraid of losing you someday is a stupid reason not to love you completely right now. Katie told me I was dishonoring Emma's memory by being too scared to love again, and she was right. Emma loved life. She lived every day like it mattered because she knew, especially at the end, how precious and fragile it all is. She'd be furious with me for wasting 2 years being too afraid to tell you the truth. What truth? Sarah asked, and there was hope in her voice now, fragile and tentative. Jake took a deep breath. This was it, the moment he'd been avoiding for so long. I love you, Sarah Mitchell. I love your strength and your stubbornness, and the way you sing to the horses when you think no one is listening. I love how you take your coffee with too much sugar and how you always check the fence line twice because once isn't enough. I love that you threw yourself into birthing a foal in the middle of a storm rather than leave her to struggle alone. I love you, and I want you in my life not as my employee or my convenient companion, but as my partner, my equal, the person I build a future with. The words, once started, seemed to pour out of him like water breaking through a dam. I want to wake up next to you every morning and know you're going to be there the next morning too. I want your clothes in my closet and your shampoo in my shower and your name on the ranch deeds alongside mine. I want to marry you if you'll have me. I want to spend whatever time we have left making sure you never doubt how much you mean to me. Sarah was crying now, definitely crying, tears running down her dirty cheeks. Jake Richardson, that's the most words I've ever heard you speak at once. Or do I need to keep going? Because I will. I'll talk until I run out of words if that's what it takes to convince you to stay. She laughed, a wet sound that was half sob, and threw her arms around his neck. He caught her, holding her close despite the blood and the mud and the amniotic fluid. She smelled like sweat and horses and Sarah, and it was the best thing he'd ever smelled in his life. You stubborn, impossible man, she whispered against his neck. I love you too. God help me, I love you so much. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other while the storm raged outside, and the new foal took its first wobbly steps beside its mother. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah was smiling despite the tears still streaming down her face. So what now? She asked. Now we wait out the storm. Then we go home. Then I call a lawyer and get your name added to the ranch title. Then we figure out the rest together, as partners, as equals, as people who love each other and aren't afraid to say it. He paused. Unless you'd rather take that job in Wyoming. Are you kidding? After all the work I've put into this ranch, into you? She shook her head. I'm not going anywhere, Jake Richardson. You're stuck with me. Good, he said, and kissed her, properly this time, with all the love and promise and commitment he should have been showing her all along. The storm eventually passed, as storms always do. By dawn, the rain had stopped, and the sun was rising over the prairie in shades of gold and pink. Tom showed up with a truck and a trailer for Belle and her foal, and the four of them, Sarah, Jake, Tom, and a ranch hand Tom had brought along, managed to get everyone safely back to the main house. The foal, a filly with Belle's dark coat and her father's white blaze, thrived. They named her Storm for the night she was born. Sarah moved her things from the cottage into the main house that same week, and Jake called his lawyer to start the paperwork, making her a full partner in the Double R Ranch. 3 months later, on a cold December morning, Jake and Sarah stood in front of a judge and made their promises official. Katie flew in from Seattle to stand as Sarah's witness, and Tom served as Jake's best man. It was a simple ceremony, nothing fancy, just the people who mattered most saying the words that mattered most. That night, as they lay together in the bed they now officially shared, Sarah traced circles on Jake's chest and asked, Do you regret waiting so long to tell me how you felt? Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking. I regret the fear that held me back, but I don't regret the journey that got us here. Sometimes people need to almost lose something to realize how precious it is. That's very philosophical for a rancher. I have my moments. He kissed the top of her head. Besides, I plan to spend the rest of my life making up for lost time. The rest of your life, huh? That's a long time. Not long enough, Jake said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie, carrying the scent of snow that would fall before morning. Inside, two people who'd almost missed their chance at happiness held each other close and let themselves believe in tomorrow. Not because they weren't afraid of what the future might bring, but because they'd finally learned that love was worth the risk. And in the barn, a foal named Storm slept peacefully beside her mother, living proof that sometimes the most beautiful things are born in the middle of the hardest storms.